It's all good. Hi, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for making time for this. It's obviously really important for us putting this together. Lots of industry faces, which makes me very happy. And it seems like it's very important for you, too. That makes me doubly happy. First, I'd like to thank Darren and Lisa for the opportunity. I had the chance of being at Kita last year in Malaysia and was absolutely floored with the event. It was super nice to be at a food symposium where content was key, where self-promotion was kind of sidelined over actual information, and we really just wanted to bring that spirit to Singapore and make sure that we could organize as thought-enriching and exciting batch conversation as we could. So we're super happy that you guys made it. The next speaker dispenses introductions, but I'll do my best because it's kind of an honor to introduce this one. Anissa Helou is a celebrated author and researcher, a speaker, and TV and radio personality with a focus on Maghrebian, Levantine, and Arab food culture. This polyvalent individual that sits right in front of me started her life in the arts, but traded for a much tastier and, dare I say at this moment, much more relevant form of art, food and cooking. She divides her time between Sicily, Beirut, and London, and is an intrepid researcher of food tradition and deliciousness, which gets us traveling around the world. She's been to Singapore before, has been to my native Brazil, and I'm very excited. Actually, I read your Estadão article. I did. Figs. No, it was about... Oops. There was a figs article about you being fed figs. No, I wrote more than one, but the first one was about Syria. There you go. Today, she will be talking about Feast, a food of the Islamic world, a very awarded book, and also much relevant to the current climate that we find ourselves in. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Anissa Helou.
Ivan abandoned me here. I have to say something first, is that what Darren said about the hedonistic attitude to food was exactly my attitude until I started writing about food. I only, thought about, I didn't cook that much anyway, but, I only thought about where to go, the markets, etc. But then I started writing about food, and my attitude changed completely, and it became much more cultural and historical, of course. And I've been writing about food for 30 years. And when I started thinking about my 9th book, which is this one, my agent wanted me to write about like a general big book on Middle Eastern food. And I was thinking about it, and then I thought about, like Claudia Roden, Paula Wolfert. There were other people who had written big comprehensive books about Middle Eastern food. And even though I could add to it, I didn't think it was original enough. So I started thinking about what I could write about that would be very meaningful. And, there are many books about Jewish food, lots, everywhere, from, in France and America and England and everything. But there wasn't a single book about what I called the foods of Islam, even though it was a civilization, like a big, very rich civilization long before the West became long before the Renaissance. And so I started thinking about it, and I started making a list of the sort of majority countries, Muslim, with a Muslim population. And, I thought that could be really interesting. And even though historically and geographically, the arc of these countries is the same as what they were in the successive empires, the food was quite different. But there was a thread, which was basically bread and kebabs, kebabs, grilled meats. So I before I sent the proposal, I made the list of the countries I thought would be interesting to include in the book. And then I made a list of the recipes. And I knew a lot. Of course, I had researched the Middle East and North Africa quite a bit. But I had never been to Indonesia. I hadn't been to Northwest China. I hadn't been to lots of countries. I had been to Africa, but not the Muslim countries. So I don't have to click, right?
No, it will move by itself.
Okay. So I made a proposal which was basically the skeleton of the book. The countries I wanted to include, and the list of recipes. Of course, things changed when I started researching the book, but I had basically, before I even started writing it, I had spent a year or 2 years, I'm talking about practically 10 years ago, maybe a little bit over than 10 years ago. So I spent a year or a bit more than a year kind of building the book basically without the content, the main content. And then we went, I gave it to my agent in London and in New York. And in London, a publisher accepted it, but the advance was really low, and it wouldn't have covered the expense of traveling everywhere, which I did, actually. I traveled extensively for the book. And then I sent the proposal to my agent in New York, and luckily a publisher in New York immediately kind of said they were interested and gave me a kind of decent advance so that I could cover both the photography and the traveling. And so I started traveling. I had covered the Middle East with other books, so I didn't really have to go back to places like Egypt or Morocco. But I started going to Zanzibar, to Indonesia, to Xinjiang, to Kashmir, although I kind of went to Kashmir a bit too late to kind of have more recipes in the book. But, what I thought was interesting is, the research was really interesting because the cuisines changed from one country to another, but as I said, there was a thread that, linked them with the staples. Rice in some countries, bread in most countries, including China, and the grilled meats, which basically were like on skewers. And then when I started thinking about how to divide the book, I thought doing it by country would be both repetitive and kind of boring. And so I started thinking about the main sort of, the main foods of Islam. And at the beginning, I wanted to call it Foods of Islam, but obviously with sensitivity. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was because of the vilification of Islam and the Muslim populations, which actually 10 years later is even more the case, because what's happening now in Palestine, between, in Israel and Palestine, or the occupied territories, and how the West is reacting to it, shows that Islamophobia has not gone at all and is still very present. So I thought about the main foods, which was bread. I called the meat, I called it the whole beast, because kind of cooking a whole animal is very relevant to different times of celebrations. And then sweets, of course, which is very important, and rice, and then produce, fish, etc. And I kind of also talked about the very important times in the religion, which is Ramadan, Eid, and all this. And so it was really interesting, to research, to write, but the reception was incredible, because in America, the book was incredibly well received. When I thought I'd be not kind of lynched, of course, but that people would not be interested or they would ignore it. And the opposite happened in London, but maybe it was because the book was published in America first and got a lot of attention. And so it wasn't so fresh in England. But given that I'm British by adoption, and I was surprised that in England it was less paid, people paid less attention to it, whereas in America, where Islamophobia is stronger, I'm generalizing, of course, it got a huge amount of attention.
Thank you, Anissa. As you were speaking, the first thing that came to mind was just watching the news today. and seeing the amount of incredible popular mobilization that exists towards what's currently happening in the occupied territories. And while I don't want to make this a conversation about politics, when you describe how popular your book was in the United States, regardless of what is our perceived attitude towards Islam, do you feel like there is a mismatched reality that we currently live in when it's concerning Islam and Islamic traditions, where perhaps for general folk like you and I walking down the street, that it's a very easy human story to connect with, that's super rich and very much a part of, as the more we study, the more we know everyone's life. But when it comes to the way that this story is represented, that perhaps the conversation changes slightly.
Well, I think also, I mean, the conversation changes slightly, but there is a disconnect between the people and the governments. So basically, as you say, there's a huge kind of wave of support from the people towards the Palestinian cause, but the governments are completely immune to it, basically, and Arab governments as much as Western governments. But the kind of Islamophobia is also propaganda, and it started with 9/11. I mean, of course it was before, but what pushed it to the forefront was 9/11. And what's interesting was even I mean, I'm not Muslim, but we always lived in the Muslim part of Beirut when I lived in Beirut. But I remember one day on the tube, shortly after 9/11, there was a bearded guy with a rucksack, and I was looking at it and I was thinking, maybe I should change the, where I'm sitting. Immediately, I mean, like, I'm not brainwashed, I'm like well-informed, I'm educated, but it still kind of played in my head that this guy was a terrorist or could be a terrorist, which is horrible.
Yeah. But I think this is going to be a topic probably that will recur multiple times today, but in that light, what do you feel is the responsibility of a cookbook writer? Do you feel it's just a recipe compilation, or do you think that there are other stories that could be portrayed when you put a book together?
No, I mean, when I put this book together, I had a very kind of clear, purpose, which was through food presenting a positive image of Islam and Muslim people and telling the history that many people didn't know about. And so when I wrote my first book on Lebanese cuisine, I had two very clear purposes. One was to record my mother's recipes and all the kind of culinary lore around Lebanese cuisine for me and for the people who were displaced by the Civil War, all the young people who didn't have the luck I had of being with my mother, grandmother, aunt, in the kitchen, seeing everything being done. So I think the role of a cookbook writer is to present recipes, of course, because that's what cookbooks are about, and test them first. And
hopefully.
Make them,
Sometimes, I'm not so sure.
Make them easy to follow. Some people don't do that, but I won't name anybody. But also to kind of put these recipes in a social and historical context. So, because food is culture after all. I mean, most people, when I was researching my first book, it was very difficult. I was reading travelogues, and a lot of them didn't have a single mention of food or Turkish coffee, like, about Lebanon. I was reading a lot of writers who traveled. There wasn't a single mention that I could, take. And also in those days, there wasn't much study, historical study, gastronomic studies. But, our role as cookbook writers is to present more than recipes and to talk about the cultures and open doors to, to the people who don't know about the food and the culture.
In that light as well, you mentioned, I'm here. The Civil War and the wars. And you grew up in an environment that was much more different to the environment that we currently live in the Levant. And, you were born in Beirut or near Beirut?
No, in Beirut.
In Beirut. And you left Beirut at a relatively younger age to go study abroad. Could you give us a little hint of what Beirut was like back in those days? And perhaps also in reference to what Beirut is like now?
Well, I mean, the cliche is that Beirut is the Paris of the Middle East. Well, for me, it was never the Paris of the Middle East because the beauty of the city had gone by the time it was overdeveloped, nothing like now. But I mean, a lot of these beautiful Ottoman houses were gone, and lots of like neighborhoods where, had big high-rise buildings. What was great about Beirut when I was growing up is that it was very much a Dolce Vita city. It's by the sea, it's very manageable, it's not big. We lived in a quarter where the main street was like the Bond Street of Beirut with lots of cafes, cinemas, a lot of life, but not, kind of mellow life, not too much nightlife and all. It's just very pleasant. So it was a very pleasant city to be brought up in because there was a lot of culture, not like concerts and exhibitions, but lots of great films. I went to a great French school. I mean, there were nuns, but apart from that, the education was very kind of, very profound, So I had what I like about the fact that I was born and brought up there and then left for Europe is that I have a very good grounding in my, where I come from. So I still have roots from where I came from. And Beirut now is, a very sad city. It was always divided between those who have and those who don't have. But now it's like practically indecent because after the Civil War, before there was no poverty, but after the Civil War, people became impoverished because the Lebanese pounds collapsed, not like now, but, and those who were middle class became not poor as such, but didn't have as much as before. And those who had still had. So, but now there is like a huge divide between those who have, and all the restaurants are full, and they live the same life. And with the collapse of the economy and the uncertain political situation, those who don't have a rather miserable life.
When you left to the UK, if I remember, to study
73.
art. To study art and art history.
No, actually I left to become an interpreter because I'm quite good at languages. But then I knew the man I lived with, and, I kind of decided that it was good to live with, I wanted to live with him, so I stayed in London, and then I studied interior design. Then because of Zaha Hadid, I went to the Sotheby's, where I entered the Sotheby's Works of Art course, enrolled in it, and then spent 20 years in the art world.
How did that shift happen from the arts and culture to the food and culture world?
Well, it was actually completely by chance, because I had hired, I got myself a literary agent because I wanted to write a book about collecting, because I was an art consultant, but I also collected for myself. But because I didn't have very much money, I collected things like ahead of the market, like fishing tackle. Nobody was buying fishing tackle, domestic wooden objects, arts and crafts, lots of things that were, that had a little market, but not a great market. So I could buy things for practically nothing. So I wanted to write a book about people like me who had like interesting collections, but without being very rich or spending a lot of money. And she introduced me to a Lebanese friend. It was 1992. And they started talking about cookbooks, and I was listening to them. And I was thinking, my mother will not live forever. Maybe I should write a cookbook and write down her recipes. But, I knew nothing about cookbooks. I didn't even respect cookbooks. For me, they were not even a literary genre. But I thought I could write it in 3 months. So I said, I could write a Lebanese cookbook. Like this, And my agent said, I have a publisher who's just come back from the Frankfurt Book Fair, and she loves Lebanese food, and she wants somebody to write a book on Lebanese food. I said, I'm your person. Little did I know that writing a cookbook was not like, jotting down recipes, but a lot more. And luckily, my agent was a very good editor, so she taught me a lot, and she took me to the Oxford Symposium, introduced me to a lot of people. And the boyfriend who I came and stayed with here 35 years ago was a very, very good cook, and had a collection of cookbooks. So I started collecting mentors. Collecting, like I was a collector. So at the Oxford Symposium, she introduced me to various people, and I chose a few people to kind of advise me. And then Donald, my ex-boyfriend, who's now dead, I went to him and said, I'm going to write a cookbook. You have to help me. And he did help me. So I started learning from various people, and of course I started buying cookbooks to see how to write a cookbook, because I didn't know. And 3 months turned into 3 years, and I wrote my first cookbook that was incredibly well received. And I liked it. It wasn't glamorous like the art world. I mean, the food world is kind of fun. But the great thing about writing about food and traveling for food is that you connect immediately with people. Whereas with art, it's like a very glamorous world, but you don't really connect with people with such ease.
You do get that sense through the books that you write them from a human filter first, and then the recipes second. And you can see that in the post as well. When you make posts about the food that you eat, you're always also representing the person that's making it. What's the value of that little nick? Because today it feels, a lot of the times we're so focused in the image and the dish and the technique perhaps, and sometimes to the detriment of the people behind it. We're going to have folks today talking about cultural appropriation and representation and bits like this, but the human quotient there in food tradition, could you talk a little bit about that and how you see it?
Well, I think it's very important, because the food that we're eating or we're researching or whatever is made by people, whether it's home cooks. Mostly it's home cooks in my case, because that's what or street food vendors. But for me, the human element is very important. And sometimes I resent chefs who don't credit the recipes. So you have, like, I don't know, an English chef or an Italian chef writing about kibbeh or about whatever. And they never say where it's from, or give also trace the recipe. I mean, you can't, there's the hummus question, where did it come from first? Well, you can't really trace. Some recipes you can't trace because there isn't enough studies, or the history is a bit vague, or because, of the Ottoman Empire, the countries where there were no nations. And I don't really believe in national food as such. I'm much more interested in regional food. But for me, it's very important to go behind the recipe to whoever gave it to me. But who's making it and where it's from, and is it like a street, like when I wrote my book about street food, is it a street food vendor and they've been making it for generations and it's mostly men on the whole, or is it a home cook or I mean, food is about people also. It's not dissociated from people. It's about culture, it's about history, it's about people. And in the Middle East, where I come from, the social context is very important. When my family, my grandmother and my aunt were very present. And when Easter, because we were Christians, when they were making mamoul for Easter, they all came and we were in the kitchen. Well, I wasn't making anything, I was just eating. But, they were making food together, and this is very important.
In that light, and back to the first conversation that we were having, we were talking a little bit about the craziness that's happening. I remember before another craziness took place in Ukraine and Russia, maybe a year or two before, there was a pretty intense debate, mostly fabricated really, about the origin of pelmenis and borscht and things like this. And it's funny as a reference, but recently we've gone through the hummus wars and the falafel wars, and now we're back to a potential real war. And it's interesting to see how food gets co-opted. Did you notice in your travels any sense of animosity or competition in that sense between the communities that you visited in the Islamic world, and any tension, or was food something a lot more fluid and easy to share? And
Actually, I didn't really, no, I didn't really notice any animosity. And as I said before, look, when you start talking about food, and I often talk to people I don't know at all, like I'm in the market or in a taxi or whatever, and I start a conversation about food. I mean, not everybody kind of lives to eat like I do and like most of us do, but everybody wants to talk about food. But where the, let's say, animosity or competitiveness comes in is actually in countries itself, like in Lebanon. If I'm inviting Lebanese friends for kibbeh, let's say, the first comment would be, it's good, but my grandmother or my mother or my aunt, I mean, there's always like, we do it better. And that's kind of natural. Sometimes it's annoying, sometimes it's not. I mean, you know, you can ignore it.
You get that a lot here. Actually, you had the experience of listening to some of this. Oh, that guy does a lot better than this guy does, right? How are we doing for time?
Fine, but we have a couple of questions from the audience.
Rock and roll. Yeah, please. Well, I think the first question, anonymous. I didn't know you were here. Do you see a decline in the passing on in quotes here, of the Islamic heritage food culture? Essentially, does a strong generational foundation still exist, or is there fear of it disappearing? Are we losing our Islamic food culture?
Well, it depends on the country. I mean, the reason why I write about food is also because of to preserve the recipes and the traditions and everything. And in countries like, take the example of Palestine, I mean, there is a lot of kind of focus on Palestinian cuisine because it's the last thing they have. But in the case of the Lebanese civil war or the Syrian uprising, there is a risk of losing some traditions and some lore, knowledge, because people get displaced. And the Lebanese immigrants of Mississippi, their tabbouleh and kibbeh and whatever dish are totally not like, I mean, for me, they're practically inedible. But, they've changed because they've been living abroad for 100 years. But in Sao Paulo, for instance, I went to Arabica, I think, and the shish barak was exactly like they made it in the women's village. So it depends on the communities and the immigrants.
Thank you. We have another question that's quite relevant to right now, but did the Islamic foods in Indonesia, you visited a few times, in Malaysia, which I believe you haven't yet, but just about, we're going to make that happen, surprise you? Do these food traditions surprise you? Was there anything that gave you a sense of familiarity or some sort of thread across this part of the Islamic world as well?
Well, actually, I didn't know Indonesian food at all, or hardly. And I was there, I was in Jakarta during Ramadan, and I think in other places, I think in Padang I was during Ramadan as well. The surprise element may not be like very strong, but Indonesian food is very different from most Middle Eastern food, but the thread is like lamb, they use lamb. There is an element of bread, always, the roti, and so there are, everywhere I've been, there was a bit of a thread, but some foods were completely new to me, like in Zanzibar, they make this bread in a pan, and they stick it to the pan, and to kind of, crisp up the top, they turn over the pan, and the dough is really, really loose. And when I saw this woman make it, I was like, it's going to fall into the fire, but it didn't. So that was totally new to me. So there were things that were totally new to me, and things that I knew, but, with variations.
Oh, in that light as well, in the light of how things move and potentially evolve, we have another question here that asks about the food culture that you grew up used to and its potential fluidity and change over time. Do you feel that your own food traditions of Lebanon and Syria, the ones that your mother cooks so well, also, she's awesome on the gram, by the way. I don't know if you had a chance, but go to Instagram Anissa Helou right now and look for her. She's like super cute. That was creepy. And also, I guess, after the civil wars and the migration of Palestinians into Lebanon and Syria and displaced immigrants across, like, has that had an impact on the landscape of the food of Lebanon specifically?
Yeah, I think the more in the what's, in the sort of traditions, like when I was growing up in Beirut, we had vegetable carts, fruit carts going through the streets, and the guy would shout out, batir, which is watermelon or figs. And then we had the kind of very delicate fruits like figs and mulberries. The guy would come to the front door with like big enamel bowls to sell them. So all these things are gone. And now that I'm researching this new book on regional Lebanese cuisine, I'm finding that the villages and the rural communities are like completely different from what I expected, and there isn't as much being made at home. Although you see them, in the villages, like making tomato concentrate, tomato paste, on wood fire and in the street. Things have changed. Some dishes are not made anymore because they're too complicated, but they still exist, and in some houses or in some communities. The recipes have not changed so much. I mean, people still, because they love, like the Italians, they love their own food, and they're very particular about how they prepare their dishes and all this. So it's more the social context, the preparations, the kind of what they call mouni, which is the winter preserves, that are made less, or that you see less walking around or traveling around. But the main repertoire is still more or less the same.
Do you see in some ways a link there between cultural resilience or communities' connection to their food tradition and their current situation or social status or harmony? In your travels across the Islamic world, I'm sure you've seen also a lot of countries where perhaps food is almost where it's less bountiful or perhaps not as big of an importance played.
I think it's always important. When I wrote a long time ago, I wrote an article about Syrian refugees and how are they losing their food or their food traditions or whatever. So it's less bountiful, of course, because when I wrote this article, they were the World Food Program, WFP, was giving each $30 a month for food, and they couldn't buy from everywhere. There were specific supermarkets. So the first week they would have meat, and then they wouldn't have meat. So they would make kibbeh with potatoes or with burghul and flour. I mean, it would be vegetarian. But the first thing that all of them bought was tea and sugar, because that was hospitality. So the concept of hospitality and of generosity is there regardless of the circumstances, because it's so much part of the culture. But the bountifulness, I mean, if they don't have money, they can't receive you the way they did before. But they would still receive you and give you food, like the woman who asked me to have lunch with her, and I said, I can come and bring you a whole lamb and you can share it with the people, the other families. And she said, no, come without anything. And she gave me a vegetarian lunch that was delicious, but that was not, that was modest, let's say.
There seems to be a constant thread there with immigrant families and their need to have access to a kitchen, even if in shelters. I just came back from a trip to Ireland, where a big chunk of the conversations we've had with displaced communities were very much about their first step into a society was being able to self-sufficiently make their own food. I find it's a comment, not really a question, but I find it super beautiful, actually, that instead of taking your lamb, that they would much rather offer something that is theirs to you as a gesture. That seems to be quite human, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and it's part of the culture. I mean, not all cultures are hospitable, but now that I spend time in Sicily, they're the same. They're very generous, very hospitable, and very kind of curious is not the right word, but they kind of embrace foreigners, which is something wonderful through food. The same in Sicily as in Lebanon, Syria, the Levant, let's say, and other cultures, of course. Wherever food culture is important, you have the sense of hospitality and generosity, because also food is all about sharing and, sharing it with people and kind of, it's part of the giving, It's making food like you chefs. I mean, I would never be a chef full time because it's too tiring, but that's your life,
How are we doing for time? Oh, great. Oh, an inner timer. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anissa. Thanks
Thank
for
you,
this talk,
Ivan.
and it's been a pleasure having you.